Welcome to today's episode, the next one in our Future of Mobility series. Today, our guest is Dan Berkovits, VP of Strategy at VIA. I'm also joined by guest co-host Julian Gio, a first-year Wharton student who is also former strategy at VIA. Join us as we discuss VIA's mission to fundamentally change how people access their cities and communities. Thank you so much for joining us today. To start off the interview, we would love to just hear a little bit more about how you view VIA and just the wide scope of what VIA does.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So VIA is, I think, at its core, a mobility and transportation innovation company. We're fundamentally a technology company. So we develop technology products for transit agencies and other entities that operate mobility services. But we also support our partners with a range of other services that are complementary to those transit technology products. So, probably most prominently, we actually offer transportation operations services, operating microtransit services and other forms of mobility like paratransit and even fixed route transit services, and then offer other auxiliary services like transit planning and consulting, marketing, other things that transit agencies and other partners of ours may need in order to be successful.
So to clarify, if I'm just like a consumer walking down the street, what are the different ways I personally could engage with VIA on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, before I answer that, I think I should, just to give you a little bit more of a sense of what VIA is, fundamentally, that's what we do, right? The things that I just described. But our goal and our mission is to make public transportation better, right? So to work with public transit agencies and other entities that offer mobility services to enhance their offerings with the goal of getting as many people to use public transportation as possible, making it more equitable, making it more accessible, making it more useful, and ultimately to shift as many people out of private cars and onto transit systems as possible. Doubling back, though, to answer the question that you just asked, most people who interact with our services will interact with them as a public transit rider, right? So if you're in a city or a town where we've partnered with a transit agency or a local government, a city, to offer a service, you may be able to use an app or have access otherwise to a service that VIA is powering with technology. So, I'm sure we'll talk more about this later in the episode, but the service that we're sort of best known for is what's known as microtransit. We can spend a lot of time talking about that, but we also support, as I mentioned, other forms of transit. So paratransit, fixed route transit, and kind of holistically multimodal transit systems. You may or may not even know that it's a VIA-powered service. We often work with our partners, those transit agencies and cities, to white label products. So, you may be interacting with it. For example, in the case of one of our prominent partners in Texas is Arlington On Demand or something like that. But VIA, in that case, is the company that's providing the technology that's powering the service in many cases. Sometimes we're actually operating the service.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, that's a great overview. I think a lot of, especially transit companies, we see something labeled with the company, but don't understand the full breadth of what's going on behind the scenes. Before we delve more deeply into microtransit and what that exactly means, just could you give us a sentence or two on your role and what sort of challenges that you specifically tackle?
I've been at VIA for about 5 years, and during that time, I've had the opportunity to do a few different things. At the moment, I'm the head of commercial strategy, which encompasses a number of different areas. Amongst them, we are responsible for service planning and design for both prospective VIA partners and existing VIA partners. And actually, Julian, who's here on the podcast today, was responsible for a lot of that service design work for a while. It's great to see him again. We also do some work around understanding, our position in the market, what our competitors are doing, how we relate to them. And also, we actually offer consulting services. So one of our business verticals is offering professional services to transit agencies, to cities, really around bringing innovation to their transit systems. So taking some of the learnings that VIA has had from operating new technology and new modes of service, and also some of the tools that we've built and using it to help transit agencies and other cities and places that are interested in operating transit services to think about how they can bring, new modes and approaches to their offerings.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. In terms of, we've kind of dived into what microtransit is at a very high level. But could you maybe explain what is the advantage of microtransit for cities or public transit agencies in terms of, meeting that goal of improving public transit?
Yeah, so microtransit can fulfill a few different use cases. I'll share a couple of them and would love to answer any follow-up questions that you might have. Microtransit really fills a gap in transit networks that agencies have struggled with for years. So, in very large major global cities, right, rail can play a significant role in transit. But certainly in most places in North America, rail is not a major player. So when we talk about public transportation, we're talking about buses, or what we'll call fixed route buses, that run along a fixed alignment on a timetable, on a schedule. And the bus, by the way, is great, right? The bus makes a lot of sense in denser areas, along dense corridors, where there are enough people, who can easily walk to that bus route to make it efficient, right? It's probably a fixed route bus is going to be the most efficient solution in a denser corridor. But in a lot of places, certainly around this country and in a lot of different countries, there are areas that are not dense enough to support efficient bus service. And some of those places have never been served at all, right? There's no transit coverage in some parts of those places. And in other places, bus networks have been designed pretty inefficiently to try and cover as much of those places as possible. So you've got bus routes that wind around, that have deviations, that extend further than they probably should, that run pretty infrequently because the agencies that operate those bus networks are really trying to stretch their resources to cover geographically as much area as possible. And microtransit, is essentially a technology-enabled demand-responsive service that serves demand in those areas in a dynamic way and aggregates as many people who are trying to travel in the same direction as possible, allowing you to relatively efficiently serve that demand. So you can basically provide, an efficient, easy to use, convenient service for people in those lower density areas that couldn't efficiently be served by bus service in the past. That lets agencies, one, sometimes extend coverage to places they were never covering before. So we've got places where people who maybe needed access to transit didn't have it. And now with microtransit, they can have that access to transit. They can get to medical appointments, they can get to work, they can shop, they can socialize, things that maybe they weren't able to do in the past. And in some cases, those transit agencies can rethink their bus networks. So they were stretching their resources to use fixed route buses for coverage in areas where it didn't make sense. Now they can use microtransit to cover those areas. They can, discontinue maybe some underperforming bus routes. They can redesign those routes. They can make them more direct. Maybe they can actually run them more frequently in the places where it makes sense. And people can also use those microtransit services for first and last mile connections to those now hopefully better performing, more efficient bus networks, right? So you're boosting transit ridership across the network and maybe even boosting ridership on the fixed route network by providing those connections to it.
Thanks. One question that I have is, you're talking about the facilitation of the first last mile between microtransit and fixed routes. How does it actually happen in practice, right? How does a rider maybe take microtransit to a bus, and sort of what does that rider experience look like, and how does VIA facilitate that in comparison to maybe some other solutions?
Great. So VIA, as maybe you gleaned from the way I've been discussing this, right? Like we really believe in multimodal transit solutions. So there are going to be places where microtransit is just the thing that makes sense, and maybe fixed route buses, or fixed routes in general don't have a role. There may be some really dense places where fixed route solutions, bus and rail, are the things that make sense. There are a lot of places around this country and in lots of other places where, a network consisting of both microtransit, or on-demand transit as we sometimes call it, and fixed route buses makes the most sense, with each mode sort of playing its role and potentially, right, people sort of knitting together trips that involve both modes. Because of that, we've designed technology products that enable that make it really easy for people to take trips on either microtransit or a fixed route bus, or in some cases where it makes the most sense on both, with maybe a microtransit leg and a fixed route leg, for example. And we've developed what we call both multimodal and intermodal products. In some cases, we'll offer people a trip proposal on microtransit and a trip proposal on fixed route transit and enable them to make a decision about what makes the most sense for them. We can also enable transit agencies to adjust what proposals people are seeing based on what makes the most sense for the transit agency. And then in terms of those first and last mile trips, when we make what we call an intermodal proposal to a rider, we're showing them potentially a first leg, for example, that would be on microtransit that's connecting to a fixed route bus. So maybe I'm in a more outlying area of the city that's pretty low density. It doesn't make sense to really cover it with fixed route transit, but there is a great frequent fixed route connection that runs from sort of the edge of my neighborhood into the core of the city. And I want to travel all the way from where I live to the core of the city. It probably doesn't make sense to take me all that way on microtransit, but because there's this frequent fixed route connection, I can, request a trip on a microtransit vehicle that's going to take me to a transfer point where I board that frequent fixed route and ride all the way downtown, for example. And the VIA app will actually show you that option, right? We'll show you that you can book a trip all the way through that starts on microtransit, connects to fixed route, and then takes you to your ultimate destination that you requested in the first place.
Wow. Sounds like there's a lot happening sort of in the back end to make these trip proposals happen. One of the advantages of traditional public transit of, a bus or a train is that it comes on a regular schedule, right? It comes every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes. And riders, particularly those who are maybe not incredibly tech savvy, there's a certain sort of comfort and reliability in that. How does VIA, given that it is a tech-enabled public transit solution and public transit is supposed to be accessible by all, how does VIA sort of maybe reach riders who maybe don't have a smartphone or who maybe aren't as tech savvy as, us sitting on this call right now?
Sure. I think from our perspective, it's extremely important that these services be accessible to all, regardless of maybe people's level of ability, their age, whether or not they own a smartphone. And so generally, our advice is that these services should always enable some form of phone booking, that people who need to can call in and book a ride. The vast majority of all of our services have some ability to book trips by phone. And beyond that, it's important to ensure that the technology itself is accessible and can be used, by people with different abilities, and also that the services are accessible in that they offer options for folks who may not be ambulatory, so that the services include wheelchair accessible vehicles. Many of our services will ask people to walk a certain distance to meet a vehicle. That's part of what makes it public transportation, right? Is that we're balancing quality of service and convenience with efficiency, right? Because it's a public service. In most of our services, I believe nearly all of our services, if somebody is not ambulatory, if they use a wheelchair or have other mobility challenges, they can be met, essentially right in front of their home by the service. So that's an important component as well.
I'm curious to know, what is the enabling technologies or capabilities right now that's facilitating this increased digitization and optimization of the transit? Is it just more access to data that's allowing you to make it more efficient, or why is now the time for all this?
Yeah, well, maybe it's worth stepping back for a second and just talking about in general, and I'll answer your question, but in general, how we're thinking about the role that we play in digitizing public transportation, and also just hopefully bringing more people onto public transportation networks, making it more useful. So VIA is a pioneer in microtransit, and I think we're the leading microtransit technology company globally. But we really see our role as establishing and creating a platform for public transportation that enables our partners to do everything from plan their services, plan multimodal transit services using technology. So we offer fixed route and on-demand planning technology for transit, operate those services, and then optimize them. So we are meeting our customer, and our partner, who are typically transit agencies and cities, kind of at every step along the way, and enabling them to do that in a seamless way, in a holistic way that makes their lives easier and hopefully helps them to operate better services for their customers who are riders. In terms of what is enabling us to help them to do that, certainly it's our ability to gather and manage large amounts of data. Also, we've developed pretty powerful algorithms for routing, for trip assignment, to enable basically more efficient on-demand service, right? So there have been some forms of demand-responsive transit service around for years, right? People are very familiar, obviously, with paratransit. There are also services that have been called dial-to-rides that would typically require you to request a trip some number of days in advance that only accepted booking over the phone. There'd be a lot of ambiguity about when maybe you were being picked up. You wouldn't know, how far out a vehicle was, things like that. So, now we have the technology to sort of more intelligently figure out how to serve that demand, to group people in an intelligent way, to make the service more efficient, and also to provide people with a lot more information about how far away is your vehicle. You can see it approaching, right? That makes the service more convenient and appealing to use, and so on and so forth.
To follow up, I feel like from what I understand, the public transit system is one of the more unprofitable ventures out there. And so how does VIA see making this more efficient fit into the company's growth? Is it a lot of getting contracts from the government or trying to turn it into a more profitable system? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, so in terms of our business model, for the most part, we do have some private and nonprofit partners, but most of our partners are public agencies, right? So transit agencies, cities, and so forth. And they're contracting with us either to offer them a technology product or to operate a service for them. So we have over 700 partners globally who, again, are almost all public sector agencies. That's in North America and around the world. In most places, it's pretty well understood that public transportation is a public good, it's a public service, and it is subsidized because it's a public good, like lots of other public services. So we don't see that as a challenge, right? The reason that public transportation is subsidized is because it's enhancing access to mobility for people who need it. It also has all sorts of positive externalities in terms of economic development and growth. And it's critical, right? We believe pretty deeply in public transportation. With that said, we're huge advocates for additional funding for public transportation because it's funded to differing degrees around the country and around the world. And there are a lot of transit systems that are doing good, but that could be doing, even more good with more resources. With that said, in terms of our role in that, there are places where hopefully we can help agencies to be more efficient, to offer more service and offer better service with limited resources. So hopefully we can play a positive role in addressing those challenges, both by helping agencies to be more efficient and also, by allowing them to offer a broader range of services to a broader range of riders to help them advocate, for the resources they need to offer more service in the future, if that makes sense.
One maybe question to piggyback off of that, and I know you probably can't give out specific numbers, but kind of curious to sort of understand on a cost basis, how does microtransit compare to sort of traditional methods of, bus or rail?
That's a great question. Rail transit, I won't spend too much time talking about rail, but rail transit tends to be, pretty efficient because you're generally only operating rail systems in places that are very, very dense. Fixed route buses, there's a huge variation. And, we typically look at the cost per trip, right? Because that's the best way to measure efficiency, right? How many people are you moving for your dollar? In very dense urban areas, buses can be very efficient. But, around this country, and again, also in a lot of other countries, there are bus systems that are operating in places that are very low density. And oftentimes those bus systems are very inefficient and it's very expensive on a per trip basis to move passengers. And there are many, many microtransit systems that are moving passengers more efficiently on a cost per trip basis, more efficiently than some of those less efficient bus systems. And there are, I would say, this is not supported by, I suspect there are hundreds or more of bus systems out there just in the US that are operating inefficiently enough on a cost per trip basis that microtransit could be a very good solution in terms of replacing some of their bus service. And there are lots of other places where there are areas that are just not covered at all because agencies have recognized that it's not efficient to serve those areas with bus service where microtransit could pretty efficiently serve those areas. Would microtransit in general...
I guess, you mentioned at the beginning of the call that you are in charge of commercial strategy now at VIA. And we've talked a little bit about sort of this balance of trying to find the right market fit almost for microtransit, right? It needs to be not too dense, but dense enough to support a service like this. Maybe how do you guys on the commercial strategy team think about identifying prospective clients and sort of what are maybe the challenges and benefits of selling to a public sector client?
There are a huge number of prospective partners for the services that we offer. One key element is beyond microtransit, right? As we mentioned, VIA offers a pretty wide range of transit technology products today, which is really exciting. And so, even if, let's say, microtransit may not be a good fit, for certain transit agencies out there, we also offer the most powerful fixed route planning and scheduling technology around. So we have something for everyone in a sense in the transit world, and we can work with pretty much any transit agency or city out there. Specific to microtransit, there are also just a huge number of potential partners because there are a lot of legacy demand responsive transit services that, would benefit from being modernized with microtransit technology. So these are the so-called dial-a-ride services that are out there. And then there are many, many, many places that occupy that kind of middle ground, right, in terms of density, where there are people who would benefit from some transit service, but either they're being served right now by services that are inefficient or they're not being served at all. So there is no shortage of transit agencies and cities that we might potentially partner with. I think there was a second part of your question, Julian.
Yeah, the second one was maybe understanding a bit about, a lot of companies that we have on the podcast are selling to, B2B businesses, for example. What are maybe the challenges and benefits of selling to public sector clients?
There are a lot of benefits, I think, of working with public sector clients or customers. First and foremost, we care deeply about what we're doing. This is a very mission-driven company. We want to expand access to mobility for people. I think that's motivating a lot of people who work here every day. And our partners, our customers, feel the same way, right? So we're trying to accomplish the same thing as they are, which is great. In terms of some other benefits, the public sector has been there for a long time and will be there for a long time into the future. We're supporting public transit services that have been around for decades at least, and that we expect to continue operating for decades at least into the future. We're helping them hopefully to do a better job of what they're doing. And if we do a good job for them, there's no reason to not believe that we won't be continuing to support them, indefinitely, basically. In terms of challenges, and I incidentally, even before, coming to VIA, have been working with, in and around the public sector for a long time. The sales cycle for the public sector is very long, right? I think people who are new to working with the public sector have to adjust to the fact that public sector agencies, they do a lot of planning and a lot of thinking before they commit to a course. Of course, you're dealing with public sector procurement, which is a lengthy and extensive process and requires some expertise. And oftentimes, public sector agencies want to do pilots and trial things for pretty extensive periods of time before committing to larger or more permanent deployments. But, we've been working with government now for years. And I think, it's something that we're very comfortable doing and we enjoy doing.
Awesome. And can you maybe dive into maybe who are like some of the typical competitors and what maybe the competitor landscape looks like in microtransit? I think a lot of people are familiar with Uber and Lyft and rideshare, but this is a completely sort of different side of the ride hailing market. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I would argue that in a sense, we don't have any one competitor just because, although I will answer your question, not to worry, but, I think we're quite unique in the breadth of what we're doing. And, in the sense that we're trying to create this platform, this holistic transit technology platform that will enable people to plan, operate, and optimize a variety of services, different types of services. As a consequence of that, well, we don't have any one competitor. We have lots of different competitors in the different verticals that we're in and in the different geographies that we're in. I think you had asked about microtransit. So specifically with regards to microtransit, we're definitely the biggest player in the microtransit space. And of course, we think we're the biggest because we're the best. And we've put a lot of time and energy over the years into both developing the best technology and a great operations team and a lot of knowledge and expertise. But within different geographic submarkets, we certainly have some competitors, right? There are other companies that are working on microtransit, which is a testament to the fact, I think, that it's rapidly growing. So we've seen more and more and more agencies and cities deploying microtransit services over the last few years. In North America, two companies that you frequently see popping up are Rideco and Spare. The routing company, which came out of MIT a few years ago, is another. And then there are some other players in Europe, for example, Aoki and Padam, Lift and Go, which is based, I want to say in Australia, although I'm not positive. But we're engaging with most of these partners on more of a geographic basis. So there's certain that you'll see kind of popping up more frequently in one country or one region or another.
Awesome. And then you've mentioned a couple of times over the course of this interview that VIA has a lot of different technology verticals that it provides. There's the microtransit, there's the paratransit element. What are maybe some of the new ones that VIA is working on sort of like under this goal of digitizing public transit you'd be comfortable sharing and that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, I think the thing that we're doing right now, that one of the things that I'm most excited about is what we call integrated transit, which is actually bringing all these things together, both from a technology perspective and in some cases actually from an operations perspective. And so bringing fixed routes, microtransit, and paratransit onto one platform, planning them on one platform, which I talked about previously, and then actually, providing our partner with a technology product that enables the rider basically to engage with them all on one platform. And we actually, in some cases, are operating an integrated transit model. Recently we were selected, which is something that I'm very excited about, by the city of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to rethink and then operate their entire transit system. So we're working with them right now. We actually took over the operation of their fixed route system and a smaller microtransit system that they're operating only on Saturdays at the moment a few months ago. We're operating that system now. We're engaging with them in a network redesign to think about, where microtransit makes the most sense, where fixed routes make the most sense, how when these two modes are operating alongside each other, they can do the best job of doing what they do best. So how the fixed route system can serve the densest areas as efficiently and frequently as possible, how microtransit can serve other areas and contribute to overall ridership, and as well as how paratransit interacts with those other modes. Not only are we planning that system, not only are we providing them with the technology platform to run the system, but we're actually operating the whole system as well. So operating all of those modes. That's, I think, an example of what's possible, and we're hoping to do more of that into the future.
Awesome. That sounds super exciting, but it also sounds like an incredibly difficult challenge, at least on the planning part, to think about all these different elements of microtransit, fixed transit, thinking about population density. What sort of tools or types of analyses do you do to maybe optimize those multiple types of services? And, is it a lot of manual work, or are there like really sort of quantitative measures that you can kind of think about to do this?
Yeah. So there's some pretty well established best practices in terms of, in general, in transit planning, in terms of thinking about looking at existing ridership, looking at population density, employment density, and thinking about where to run fixed route transit service. As I mentioned earlier, typically that conversation has been limited by the fact that you need to cover other areas, right? So you can't design the fixed route system to be as efficient as possible. From a technology perspective, we use our own Remix platform. So I used to say years ago, if I wasn't working at VIA, that I wanted to be working at Remix. And then VIA acquired Remix 3 years ago, almost exactly. So that problem was solved for me, which is great. So Remix is an amazing series of tools for transit planning and scheduling And since bringing Remix into the VIA family, we've been continuing to invest in it, continuing to invest in bringing algorithmic insights from the VIA engineering team into the platform. So we use Remix to do that kind of transit demand analysis, to do that transit performance analysis, to look at how the existing fixed route system is doing, and to think about how we can operate that fixed route system as efficiently as possible. We also can plan microtransit services in Remix. So we introduced, subsequent to bringing them into the fold, an on-demand planning tool in Remix that enables us to basically look at different on-demand zones and understand what the potential ridership is in those zones and how many vehicles we need to serve them and so on and so forth. And we also have some other tools and approaches that we use internally beyond the Remix platform.
Now to switch gears a little bit, given we're an MBA tech podcast, I'd love to use the last section to talk about how to find careers and opportunities in this space. And it's a one that so many people are excited about, but seems to be maybe one of the more tumultuous industries as of late. Based on your experience, broadly speaking, how would you advise people with a business background on getting into the future mobility space, either at VIA or just broadly into the industry?
Sure. I'm personally not an MBA by background. I went to law school, actually, and I also went to school for urban planning. So I have a graduate degree in urban planning as well. So, I'm not sure how, hopefully this advice is useful. I started working years ago as a lawyer. Personally, I've always been very interested in and passionate about cities, infrastructure, transportation, and that has been sort of a thread through the different things that I've done over the years. Prior to coming to VIA, I was working at a big infrastructure company in a non-legal role at that point, in a business role, but looking at different types of infrastructure. And I just became increasingly engaged in and passionate about transportation. And what brought me to VIA was just witnessing the extent to which VIA was using technology to really enhance and complement what the public sector was doing and to solve public problems. And so to the extent that I can offer advice to MBA candidates or, MBA students who are interested in mobility and transportation, it would be, just to dive into that field of mobility and transportation. And I think how I ended up here was just by being passionate about transportation. And I think we hire a lot of people here who are passionate about transportation and about solving mobility problems. That's not really an answer in terms of how you might get into technology in general, but I think that if you're interested in mobility tech, just learning as much as you can about it, maybe even getting engaged in these issues in your own city where you live and work, volunteering even, can be really effective, because I think people who are working in this field, whether they're working on micromobility or transit technology or autonomous vehicles, are really passionate about this, right? So I think one of the best ways to find an opportunity is by demonstrating to people who might be hiring that you care a lot about this too, and that, you want to be working on it and helping to solve some of these really challenging problems.
That makes sense. Future mobility, microtransit seems like one of those industries where everyone's just, it's something that people could truly be passionate about. And so I agree. Someone doing similar industries, just learning as much as you can is a key way to move forward. Some closing thoughts and closing questions, but looking ahead, what do you see as the most exciting developments in the broader future mobility industry in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'm personally very excited about some of the things that are happening in the mobility as a service space, which is our MOS. You'll hear about MOS apps and things like that. Incidentally, and I'm not saying this just because it's convenient, VIA actually a year ago acquired Citymapper, which is a major player in the MOS space. And actually, to the extent that we're offering a product directly to consumers today, it's the Citymapper app, which you can download and use for free in lots of different cities around the world. But I do think that's something that's going to be key to sort of encouraging people to take advantage of not just, public transit modes, but other things like, micromobility, so bike share, scooters, to the extent that market still exists in a couple of years, and other new modes, is going to be making it really seamless and easy for them to do, both in terms of planning trips and paying for trips and things like that. And it's a space that's still shaking out to some extent, but I think it's really important and critical. Another area that VIA has done a little bit of work around actually is road use charging, which is basically figuring out how to pay for roads in the future and pay for, the surface transportation system, which is going to become increasingly important as we adopt, hopefully, electric vehicles. Personally, I'm also very interested in, vehicle electrification, and that's something that VIA is working on as well, because we've got lots of partners who are, very aggressively thinking about how to electrify their fleets or otherwise transition to zero emissions fleets. And that's something that we're supporting them in doing. And for students who are interested in this space, I think there's a lot of opportunity around all of those fields that I just mentioned.
One question I maybe have on the back of that is, I know VIA partners with a couple autonomous vehicle partners such as Made Mobility. Do you think autonomy can maybe play a key role in the future in terms of, changing the transportation business model or accessibility?
I think eventually it absolutely will. I think it certainly will. I think that it's difficult to say with certainty at what pace that change will happen. I do think that our engagement in that space is kind of predicated upon the idea that, AVs can maybe be most powerful as a form of shared and public transportation. And so, just for context, Julia knows it well, but we recently have teamed in a number of places with May Mobility, but we've teamed with other AV providers as well to enable AV microtransit services or AV on-demand services, essentially, where, VIA is not providing the actual autonomous vehicle software or hardware, but we are providing the software that enables essentially a shared public transportation service using those AVs. So riders can book an on-demand trip like they would in a conventional on-demand service. Rides are pooled like they would be in an on-demand service. So passengers are aggregated heading in the same direction and so on and so forth. We're just not actually, delivering the instructions to the vehicle in terms of how to actually steer and drive it. I think that's really important and interesting. And we've seen actually just in the last couple of years an increasing interest in doing these pilots. I do think it'll be an important part of the future. I just don't know kind of at what pace.
Thank you, Dan. It's really a exciting, but at least in my view, or tumultuous but exciting industry. There's so much going on and so much that could also go wrong, but it's very exciting. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I think, I feel very fortunate to be here at VIA, and I think, we're excited to be doing the work that we're doing. We appreciate the opportunity to work with great partners, so great transit agencies, to hopefully make people's lives better. And I think that, if any Wharton students or others are interested in, coming into this space, it is an exciting space to be in. I think it's changing very rapidly. Certainly, it's been an interesting couple of years where we've seen, I won't name names, but certain models rise and other models maybe sort of recede a little bit. But in the end, right, people need to get places. And, I think there are a lot of tools and new technologies that have come along in the last couple of years to enable people to live better lives and for agencies to impart, different providers basically to do what they're doing more effectively and more efficiently. So it's a great time to be doing this work. And there's a lot of positive change that's left to make happen.
Awesome, Dan. Well, thank you so much. If you ever want to come solve Philly's transportation problems, let us know. But until then, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.